And welcome everyone, welcome to the panel. I like the fact they're sitting down and I'm standing up. I'm not quite sure what to read into that, except that standing up I've got more authority, that's how I'll put it. I know the topic of tonight is conflating religion and nationalism in autocratic rule, but I think having had some preliminary discussions and where we might take the conversation, I don't think it's always going to be about autocratic rule. I don't know whether you think the Morrison government is autocratic. Maybe some people do, but I do think religion and nationalism in the domestic context is also of interest to talk about. So we'll start big, start with a global view, have a little bit of a trot around the world, and then we'll bring it home to Australia. So if I can start with the key parts of the world where religion and nationalism are conflated, and maybe the most pertinent example right now is in Ukraine, well, in Russia with the invasion of Ukraine, and what that has meant for the Orthodox Christian Church. And Fotis, if I can ask you here, because the invasion really has split Orthodox Christians, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. It really fundamentally has. Whether it's resulted in a kind of a national, ethno-national split, I'm not sure. But in terms of the ecumenical patriarch in Constantinople or Istanbul, where the first among equals, as we call them, sits, he's made a clear distinction and a split from the Russian Orthodox Church.
Well, give us a little bit more background to that, because...
Well, it's fascinating because the head of the ecumenical patriarchy is a Turkish citizen. You can't be the head of the ecumenical Orthodox patriarchy unless you are a Turkish citizen and you serve in the Turkish army. So your allegiance is to the state. And that heralds all the way back to 1453 when the Ottomans came in, and then the Greek Church said better the fez of the Pasha rather than the cassock of the Pope. It's kind of a reasonable assumption. I guess you'd rather be under the Pax Ottoman. It's much freer for you as a church in the millet. So yes, so in a sense his allegiance is to the state of Turkey and to the Orthodox ecumenical community. The Russian Orthodox Church, quite different from the 1700s onwards, is quite an imperialist church, very wedded to the imperialist state of Russia. It's an old and traditional relationship. So in the sense of Putin, it's not, people would say, well, he's using religion. Actually, they're using each other quite comfortably. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church is very much a nationalist and pan-Slavic nationalist who goads Putin, and Putin goads him. So they've all split. Now, schisms are not new to the Greek Orthodox Church. We've been good at that for many, many years, at least 1,000. But in this case, it's very much a political, social and cultural split between Russian Orthodox and Greek Orthodox. And the Russians more recently put out went to the UN and basically told that the Greece, for the first time in 100 years or so, we no longer consider you as Orthodox brothers, which is a fairly powerful statement because we're starting to take Ukrainian refugees in. So it's a very interesting position to be in, particularly during the Balkan Wars when the Greek state was the only state in Europe not to openly condemn Serbian aggression. So it is a it's a watershed in the relationship.
And Fotis, in terms of the Russian context, how much of it is institutionalised religion and state, working together, and how much of it is individuals? I mean, I note that Patriarch Kirill of Moscow, who's the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, his language is quite extraordinary. His backing of Putin is it's not silent or quiet. I mean, he's out there very vocal in his support. How much of that is around the individual, and how much, regardless of the individual, would the relationship between church and state have allowed for that anyway?
Look, I'm not a theist, but I could say comfortably that to extricate the church from the state, be it Russia or Greece in this case, is very difficult. These countries have not been through an enlightened period like France or Britain. They were post-industrial, feudal, under the Ottoman millet. Orthodox or Christians, Jews and Muslims lived in their own communities and wedded each other. So they were wedded. The church or the faith and state were consistently wedded. And in Russia particularly, I would say, without being a specific historian to Russia, that they were always enmeshed up until the Bolshevik period. And even then, for a period under Stalin, he brought back the church to guide some of his views. So to to split them would be very difficult, I think. I think they're very structurally, emotionally linked and based around the notion of a pan-Slavic state. And it also goes back to the 1700s or 1600s when the Russian Orthodox Church then split from the Greek one, saying, well, we want to have canon in Russian and we no longer want to have preaching or the canon read in Greek. Because up until then, you have to read Greek, whichever Orthodox Church, whether you're Serbian or Bulgarian or Russian, you have to speak in Greek, not unlike the Quran has to be preached in Arabic. That were the first great splits where these countries or these jurisdictions went into using liturgy in their own language.
I'd like to sort of shift a little now across the world. And Mahmood, if I can ask you about Afghanistan, obviously a very different country, but one that is also very troubled at the moment. And there's a lot of talk about how the Taliban has co-opted Pashtun nationalism, if you like, but then also uses the religious language as well. How do you see the conflation of religion and nationalism under the Taliban?
I think the Taliban strategy in this context is quite interesting because they're essentially channeling Afghan nationalism into religious nationalism. They believe in a very purist form of Islamist nationalism. Islam contains teachings that clearly argue against the most important elements of nationalism. Foremost among these elements are the exclusiveness engendered by the nationalist project, which is all about inspiring the people to establish an autonomous state, so more of a separatist kind of thing. The Quranic message was delivered to be heard by human beings of all land and ethnicities, so Muslim leaders have often called for the Islamic Ummah to unite, so it was more of a union, not so much an exclusivist kind of project. Historically, though, Pan-Afghan nationalism had often emerged as a form of resistance against foreign incursion, classically, bringing together a cross-section of Afghans, cross-section of ethnicities and tribes bound by a common identity against an outside threat. While religion was an important rallying factor, that Pan-Afghan nationalism was less about Islam and more about Afghans standing against these common threats. So the principal underpinnings of that nationalism were broken down during the American invasion of Afghanistan, where hopes of a democracy overshadowed that common enemy uniting thread. So what we have is some Afghans who want a democratic government, being supported by the West, and some who want a more conservative government that is grounded in the Sharia and Islamic principles. The problem is that the Taliban's method towards nationalism hinged on their emerging re-Islamization agenda, which includes a security force with martyrdom soldiers and reforming the education curriculum, which is still unclear at this stage as to what that entails. Afghanistan's historical dynasties would have preserved their power over peoples of different backgrounds by respecting diversity. The Taliban has built its legitimacy on religious totalitarianism and controlling all aspects of people's lives. So past dynasties would have used power to seek wealth and rule, but now the Taliban utilize power and wealth to impose ideology, identity, and in some cases, language. We've seen an echo of this before in Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood embraced Islam as the quote-unquote solution to transform society, placing it at the heart of national politics. The Brotherhood opposed moderation, resisted compromise with Republican values against popular demands, and applied Sharia-based gender segregation. This extreme political Islamism ultimately made the movement a victim of its own ambitions. In weaponizing Islam, the Taliban have created an existential crisis of coexistence between the Taliban and non-Taliban Afghans, completely dividing and segregating the country. There has been some speculation and criticism of the Taliban as a Pashtun nationalist group, and I've even heard it being described as a Pashtun supremacist group, but I'm not convinced that's the case. Although the majority of the leadership, even among the fractured factions, the Haqqani Network and Mullah Abdullah Ghani Baradar's group, are all Pashtun. The Pashtun way of life has traditionally been governed by a secular tribal code. They believe in secularism. It's in the Pashtun Wali, which is implemented among it's implemented through another tribal institution, the Jirga, which was a word thrown around a lot in the 90s. A council which arrives at decisions by consensus and has no head. The Taliban in '94 declared the Jirga system to be completely un-Islamic.
I would have thought, though, today, in a country like Afghanistan, where there's been so much division for so long, any attempt to conflate nationalism and religion is, well, it's not going to work, because in essence people live by their own trust networks. They live by what has helped them survive over decades. Is there something in that the ability to manipulate things is much harder in a country that's been so fractured for so long?
Yes, but I also think that faith has got them through the long war, and has been the only thing that's provided any sense of hope for the masses, particularly those in the regional areas outside the cities where there have been, countless drone strikes that we actually haven't heard about, and many people have died. And it seems as though faith is the essence of what gets those families and those communities through it. And the Taliban seem to weaponize that sense of hope and use it to their advantage.
Tony, do you have any thoughts on Afghanistan before we move on?
Not really, I have to say, and disappointing for you, except to say that I never worked there. It was beyond my territory in the Middle East when I was correspondent there. Of course, over the years I've paid attention, and I suppose I haven't really been in the least bit surprised that the Taliban was able to reconstitute itself, and now we see that they're in control of the country. I just want to say a couple of things. Ahmed, thanks for inviting me to participate in this forum. Ali Moore, it's an absolute pleasure to share this stage with you. I was just thinking today, our relationship goes back 30 years now, when we were young students at the Point Cook Language School learning Mandarin. We were both in China together. I'm not going to put your tones to the test here, and perhaps I should also mention that Ali and I went to the same institution not a million miles from the Geelong Shell oil refinery.
You do go back a long way. I'm getting too old now.
Not at the same time, which should be obvious to you all. I just want to add as well, just a detail about my background. I spent 10 years in the Middle East as correspondent, living in Cairo. I've attended a lot of iftar dinners with my Egyptian hosts. I'm not sure if there's anyone here of Egyptian origin, but what you needed if you attended these events in Cairo was what I used to call food endurance. We broke the fast, but these elaborate dinners would go on far into the night and into the early morning. I'm not sure what else I can say, Ali, before you ask me some questions about the subject I meant to be talking about.
Before I actually get to, because the next country...
I just want to say one other thing. I took a particular interest in the Palestinian movement when I was in the Middle East. In fact, wrote a book about the Palestinians. I'm not sure if there are any people of Palestinian origin here this evening, but I should say I have a lot of sympathy for their cause, if I can put it that way. They are in some ways these days the forgotten, not the Menzies forgotten people, but the forgotten people of the Middle East.
I was actually going to move away from the Middle East with you, Tony, though, and look at the West, because I think Donald Trump is the really obvious example. Very few of us would forget the images of the peaceful protesters being tear gas, so Donald Trump could stand in front of St John's Episcopal Church holding up the Bible. how would you see Trump's use of religion and nationalism?
Yeah. Before talking about Trump, and I'm a bit intimidated, frankly, with Sarah James sitting over there. She should be sitting here, and it would certainly add to the diversity of the panel. But I'd just like to share with you my own experience of reporting in America, where religion certainly played an important part in an election outcome. That was the election of 2004, before answering the question about Mr. Trump. In 2004, that was the second election that George W. Bush contested for the presidency. I had taken, as correspondent in Washington for the Financial Review, a lot of interest in the religious component of American politics. As Sarah would attest, I'm sure politics is enmeshed with religion in America, religion is enmeshed with politics. In my planning to cover the election, I looked at a map of America to locate what I thought was the most appropriate place in Middle America to report the war from. Fortuitously, there's a town called Middletown in Ohio, which is north of Cincinnati, south of Dayton. So I took myself to Middletown for a week or more, and I'm sure Sarah, if she's ever been there, it's one of the most boring places in all of the United States. But it was actually the perfect place, the perfect vantage point to view the election, the presidential election of 2004. It was, perhaps people don't recall, and why would you remember necessarily, but it was a very close run thing. Bush narrowly won that election, and he won because he carried Ohio. And he carried Ohio because of the support of evangelicals in Ohio. And the evangelical movement in the Bible Belt, I'm not sure if it's correct, Sarah, to call that part of Ohio as part of the Bible Belt, but I believe so, perhaps further south that, helped him carry Ohio by a very small margin. But I spent quite a bit of time during that election campaign talking to evangelical members of the evangelical church, pastors, and getting a real sense of the sort of ability of this movement to deliver politically for Mr. Bush.
And Tony, we are going to run out of time, so can I ask you to throw that into Trump? I mean, was it very different under Trump? Maybe it wasn't.
Well, I think it's probably fair to say Mr. Trump is possibly the most irreligious president of the United States in the history of the Republic. But he made good use politically, of course, of the evangelical movement. It's hard to believe, I know, but 90 to 95 million Americans identify as evangelicals, many of them born-again Christians, and the definition of that is, they've accommodated themselves to a spiritual renewal. And they helped Mr. Trump secure victory in the election against Hillary Clinton of 2016. And without that support, he wouldn't have defeated her. So the evangelical movement, very disciplined in their support for conservative side of politics in America, helped deliver the presidency to him in 2016.
Do you think, though, maybe Fotis, if I'll put this question to you, that we saw caps during the Trump campaign, things like "Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president," and I don't know whether you read, but recently the New York Times wrote a really interesting piece, and this is not in Trump's time. This piece was written 3 weeks ago, saying many believers are importing their worship of God with all its intensity, emotion, and ambitions to their political life. At events across the US, it's not unusual for participants to describe encountering the divine and feel they're doing their part to install God's kingdom on earth. For them, right-wing political activity itself is becoming a holy act. So if it goes back to 2004 and then it ramps up with Trump, where are we now?
I think it goes back to the beginning of America, though. I think, having lived in America and worked in Harlem and worked very hard with civil rights movements, I couldn't but notice the impact of faith in civil rights movements. Seeing the Abyssinian Orthodox Church, seeing the impact of Islam in African American politics. So I don't know, as a non-American and having lived there, it's one of the most faith-bound nations or republics on earth. And even if you look at Thomas Paine in his treatise, the first thing he points out is the Mohammedans, he says, the Jews and the Christians will live together in this great republic. So the notion of calling on spiritual guidance in America is not unique only to the right. Having said that, I also think that the Democrats, well, Nixon, as we all know, and my colleagues there would know more than I would, did hit the Southern Democrats. Found them in his election. They were abandoned by the Democrat Party when they went into civil rights. The South felt that they were abandoned, and the Republicans picked up an unnatural constituency, which were poor, revivalist Southern Americans, and they've been rusted on since. So yes, I don't know that you can be in American politics and be openly atheist or profoundly secularist without paying some finality to God. Even there are pictures that we have of the Archbishop, the Greek Orthodox Archbishop of New York, walking with Martin Luther King down the street. So it's a kind of an interesting republic, a republic of faith in many ways, that guides America, as opposed to the sort of liberal democratic model of a British, rather Protestant and cool movement forward. It is entwined with this notion of faith. I mean, not forgetting other Europeans left, and the Spanish from Mexico and other places left for faith and ended up. So it was a providence that brought them there. So I don't know that it's purely a right-wing thing.
Let me ask Tony, because you were nodding.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that in the case of Mr. Trump, I think his supporters invested him with a sense that he was representative of some sort of divine being. I mean, it's frankly hard to believe, I know. Nevertheless, you know, he had created this sort of aura around himself, and of course he was the sort of showman who could capitalize on these sort of things. Hard to believe sometimes Sarah, our American friends, could be so naive, but you know, he had the ability, like an old, I want to call him an Old Testament prophet, but like a sort of fairground spruiker, ability to sort of mobilize support among his followers and create this aura about himself, which almost had a religious component to it.
Mahmood, can I ask you to maybe, can you contrast what we've just been talking about with the US and go back to what you see with what you were talking about in Egypt, or what you're talking about in Afghanistan?
I think for me, it's more about just simplifying the message, and you know, it's less about what somebody's policies are, it's more about what their beliefs are. And that message was really crystallized when that whole neocon thing came to power, and it was all about illustrating good and evil in a very simple way. And that rhetoric was revived with Bush, with that kind of symbolism followed through into the Trump era, but in an even more simplistic way.
Does it matter who's delivering the message? That's the...
I think it does. But yeah, I'm not sure how that message was co-opted. Like Tony mentioned, in cyberpolitics and so on, with the fringe and QAnon, Trump was really illustrated as this savior that was going to come and tear apart this cabal in some way. So those messages and those symbols really were co-opted, and particularly for his character, and it really worked.
Ahmed set this exam question, which I found a bit challenging, I have to say. Nationalism and autocratic rule. I think that in Trump's case, given the opportunity, he would have asserted autocratic rule in the United States, but it's a tribute to the American system that he was constrained from doing so, but he certainly pushed the boundaries. frankly, to the limit and indeed beyond limits. And I think, Ali, you asked about January the 6th, 2020. There's no doubt in my mind that he was trying to incite his followers to conduct some sort of takeover of the capital and an attempt to reverse the election result of the previous November. So, given half a chance, I think Mr. Trump, who, quite frankly, I don't think had a very sophisticated view of American jurisprudence, if I can put it that way, and political norms, would have crudely used the support of the mob to try and overturn the election itself.
I'm still, with all of you, I'm quite curious about this question though, about who delivers the message, because what I find interesting is that whether it's in Russia and its support for the church supporting Putin, regardless of how horrific Putin has behaved, or if it's in Afghanistan, where the Taliban is clearly not in the best interests of the country from the perspective of so many people, or whether it's the horrors that Trump imposed on the US, why is it that religion is able to be co-opted? What is it about people's faith that allows them to look beyond the ills of the person who is espousing their religious belief?
I think, if I may, the framing of the question is interesting, because I'm not sure that secularism itself, and I speak as an atheist, is devoid of equal misunderstanding. If you look at secular movements, which are also teleological, whether they're the Jacobins, whether they're Bolsheviks, there's masses of graves throughout history born on the notion of the republic or the secular value. And I think in some ways we seem to find it easy to blame faith. I think it's easier to blame politics and class and regional differences and economics, first and foremost. Faith is an adjunct, as is secularism. I mean, if you look at the horrors of World War I, World War II, Pol Pot, the Bolsheviks, you could probably amass millions and millions of deaths which have nothing to do with faith at all. And I think in some ways liberals, in the broadest sense of liberals, in the liberal democratic principle of Bentham and Mills and myself and others, will find it comfortable to say, oh, well, secularism is really the pan metronariston, the apex of where we want to get. And yet, even my father, an ex-communist, bless his soul, as I say now, even though I'm an atheist, he'd go up to the Parthenon and he'd say to me, son, this is the secular temple. And then in hindsight, I realised, well, it actually wasn't a secular temple. It was a virgin's temple. So I don't know that we ask the right questions from the so-called West. Even the notion of the West is confusing for me, because I sit here with Ahmed and Mahmood and I think, well, which part of the West am I in? I'm still in the Caliphate, I was under 400 years, where I'm a Greek, I'm from the East, I mean, if we've overladen secularism and liberalism with some teleological and spiritual notion that its apex is right, it's pure, it's not. I mean, religion has got the same foibles and same plasticity as secularism has. It can be a peaceful, Abbasid caliphate, an enlightened one that brings in Plato and Aristotle, and it could be the Taliban. You could have an orthodox, enlightened Bartholomew that says it's ecumenical and you could be gay and still be part of the church, and you could have the Archbishop of Russia who wants to murder everyone. So I mean, really, it's ideology, really, at the end of the day. It's the way you interpret it. And as far as the vessel, I was at a mosque yesterday. I go every year to a mosque with my cousins, Muslim cousins, and I said, you know that I'm an atheist. He said, it doesn't matter. As long as you supplicate, you might become a vessel for Allah. So, and before that I was at a Passover, and then before that I was at a Greek Orthodox church. So clearly...
All right, I'm not sure it actually addresses the question that I had. I mean,
your question presupposes that secularism is somehow unable to create the horror.
No, it doesn't at all. I don't know. I don't have an argument about it, but my question is really simple. It's simply why is it that people are able, through religion, to overlook the other motivations of the people who are preaching? Let's steer clear of the Middle East. Why does Trump succeed? What is it about him that allows him to co-opt to become this religious figure.
What did Mencken say? Sarah, never underestimate the taste of the American people. Look, I think there's I'd say this very carefully, a characteristic of my American friends that they tend to look for possibly some sort of messianic figure among their leaders, and there's not many apparent in this latest period. But I think there's a very idealistic strain in America, and religion, of course, plays a huge role in that country. I mentioned before, and it's hard to believe, isn't it? 90 to 95 million Americans declare themselves as evangelicals. I'm not sure what the percentage of who would declare themselves Catholics, but a big percentage. And then the Lutherans. So religion plays a huge role in America, and I suppose it's a matter of belief. We might say blind faith, but it's a potent force in America, and that's what enables, frankly, unscrupulous people like Mr. Trump to take advantage of the situation. And that's one of the characteristics of America that, frankly, confuses me. But it's the way the country is, and you can't deny it.
And I do want to take questions from the floor, but before we do, and we've hardly touched on this subject really. We've touched on Afghanistan and the US and Russia, of course. India and Hindutva is fascinating. You've got what's going on in Myanmar. But because we are going to run out of time, let's bring it to our own back garden. And I know that, Fotis, you've made the comment that I think you had every political leader under the sun through an Orthodox church at Easter time. There wasn't anyone who left it out. But
No.
How do you see religion playing, maybe nationalism as well, in the Australian context?
Well, I'm not sure, but I do know that, like I said last weekend, I saw every political leader I could imagine at every Orthodox church, they were from Brisbane right across to Sydney here. It's become more important lately. I think Australia was a far more secular country. I think when we talked about multiculturalism, we talked about language, we talked about access to services, now we talked about multi-faith. I'm not saying it's a wrong thing, but it's a real thing. People are more faith conscious right now rather than being traditional faith. You have the Catholic Labor Party, Protestant Liberal Party, and then everyone else in between. Now it's really about revivalism. Islam's played a role too. We have a lot more Muslim people in Australia now than we had, say, 30, 40, 50 years ago, Hindus and so on. It's an easy thing, isn't it, really? It's easier to go to a Greek Orthodox church or a temple, pay your allegiance, and then get that vote than it was in the past to talk about class and access to services. I think so. It plays a role. Whether it plays as a fundamental role as it does in America or in Turkey or even in Greece, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the Prime Minister's revivalist credentials make much difference to most Australians.
Well, let me ask you what you think.
I think I agree with Fazal. I'm not convinced that it does have as much of an effect. I know maybe in my own community, in the suburbs, among young Muslim men, there has been a slight shift towards the Liberal Party because they feel like they're more closely aligned with their belief patterns, which is a pretty radical shift from most of them voting Labor.
And that's because they see someone like Morrison support the value system or the beliefs that they also hold dear.
And that they want to preserve in some way. I think that appeals to them. I think they perhaps might think that there's more uncertainty on the other side for some reason, which is interesting because most of the people in my friendship circles are born and raised here, and were drawn closer to their faith after 9/11. So, excuse me. Yeah, it's interesting how that shift, how I've noticed that shift, and how, as they've grown older, they've been drawn closer to those kinds of belief systems.
Just two things, Ali. I looked at the census of 2016, and I think something like 260,000 respondents to that census identified themselves as Pentecostalists. That number would be closer to 300,000 now. Now, in overall terms, that's not a big percentage of the population, but the significant point is that it's a fast-growing religion, obviously, or part of the Christian church, but many of these Pentecostalists tend to be concentrated in the outer suburbs. And this is Mr. Morrison's target audience in a sense. This is his comfortable terrain, and I think some of his politicking obviously is directed at evangelicals, Pentecostalists in these fringe suburbs. The other thing I would say very quickly is that the Labor Party, particularly because it holds these seats in the western suburbs of Sydney, is much more conscious of socially conservative Muslim attitudes, especially as a consequence of the plebiscite on same-sex marriage. So religion is intruding itself into our politics, nothing like America, but it is becoming more of a factor. And I think Mr. Morrison, is partly an agent for that. And I don't decry or question his religion, as some people do, and I think quite crudely and unfairly, but nevertheless, he has contributed a religious tinge to the political debate, and let's hope it doesn't go much further.
We are almost out of time. I want to try and get a question from the floor. Do you want to?
No, just very, very briefly. One pattern that's emerging, and we've noticed in the newspaper, is that younger people, Australian-born younger people, are far more religious than their parents were and their grandparents.
And what do you put that down to?
It's a unifying element. I'm not sure what it is. I know that my father and his crew were very secular, anti-faith, anti-church, and there was schism between the community and the church. Right now, we can't ignore the church anymore. We used to ignore the church consistently in the newspaper. It's impossible to ignore it now because our readers demand that of us, and they're born here, and they're far more religious than Greeks in Greece.
Do we have we've got a couple of minutes left. A quick question from the floor. Come on, I haven't asked everything. Just over here, if you just stand up and project.
Just on your point about the Muslim community, I was in Lakemba a few nights ago, Western Sydney, and there was a big group of young Muslim men wearing Clive Palmer United Australia t-shirts. I'm just wondering where you think that has come from. What is he speaking to in that community?
I was going to say he's given lots of ads to ethnic media. It's been great for us.
What do you have for?
I think a lot of that comes from the way certain communities might have been policed during COVID, and they were susceptible to a lot of the conversations that were happening online, and they felt like they'd been further marginalised or ostracised from the wider Australian community, and Clive Palmer kind of capitalised on that and really created a social media campaign that targeted people that felt vulnerable and in some ways manipulated.
I have to agree with Mahmood. I live in the north, and if you're a tradie, you loathe Dan Andrews essentially. And Clive Palmer's ecumenical. He uses both left and right language, and he brings everyone in. And one of the dangers that Labor Party is facing is that sandbagging a lot of traditional Labor seats against Clive Palmer.
Just very quickly, I spent quite a lot of time in 2005 in America in evangelical megachurches in the south of the country. I was interested in the subject, interaction in politics and religion, and it was very noticeable to me the number of young people that were involved in these megachurches. And I think here in this country, especially in the Pentecostal movement, a lot of young people are attracted to Pentecostalism. It's the music and these sort of community.
You don't have to fast.
They get. And you don't have to fast, exactly. And I think these young people as well are searching for meaning in life, and I think this fills a void for them.
Do we have time for one more? Is that it? Over here.
Yeah, just in relation to Afghanistan, Taliban, the term Taliban, where is it driven from? I mean, where is it derived from?
I believe it's literally translated means the students.
Yeah. Okay. So Taliban.
So they were students, weren't
Yes,
they, of
yes.
Of the madrasas?
Yeah.
So seeker of knowledge, yeah.
I believe so.
So whoever pursues and seeking knowledge, would they cause any dramas or problems in societies?
I mean, that could be a title, but that might not necessarily be
Because life itself is your teacher, yeah? You're constantly in a state of learning, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think you've made the point there.
Ali, could I ask a question?
Here you go.
Could I insert your role?
Yes.
What's the difference? I'm not asking you, I'm asking the other panel and colleagues here. What's the difference between an atheist and agnostic, by the way? I would identify as an agnostic. You described yourself as an
Well, I'd use
because I'm not sure.
No, well, I use AJ Ayres. I think both atheists and agnostics are wrong, AJ Ayres said, because the atheist is determined that there's nothing there and there might be, and agnostic plays a bet, and an theist has no proof of it, so I don't really know. I mean, I'm waiting for God to whisper, and he hasn't yet, so once he does, I'll come to you.
And look, we are out of time. A really quick comment from each of you. Do you think that religion and nationalism, across the board, a huge generalised statement, but broadly a unifier or a divider?
I personally prefer to think that patriotism is a good thing, nationalism is a disastrous thing, and when you blend religion with nationalism, it becomes even increasingly more disastrous.
Well, I think that religion's intrusion into politics is a bad thing because it can be misused by unscrupulous people, and I think we've perhaps seen examples of that in the recent past.
And I would agree. I think, particularly in regards to the Taliban, it's been weaponized to suit an agenda more so than it's actually being to represent what the faith actually believes, to represent that wholeheartedly.
Please join me in thanking our panel very much. I'm sorry we can get to everyone's questions, but we are over time.
So thank you very much to our panellists. We'll just quickly continue with the program just to make sure that we let people out at a reasonable time. So at this stage of the evening, we'll be looking to, we've invited a few of you to say a few words about tonight's program, and I was going to ask, firstly, one of Australia's best known cobbers, if I can maybe invite Father Bob Maguire to say a few words and just a quick background before he's ready. Now he can stay at his seat. We'll hand the microphone to you. Go there. No, stay where you are, please. Stay where you are. We'll bring your microphone to you. And before you say something, I just want to give you a bit of a background.
Impressive up there where you are.
More than welcome to come up here, but I thought it would make it easier for you. All right.
Well, I'm a Virgo and I'm an actor. So if you fall over, get you the paper. This way, huh? Yeah. Now, what did I bring with me? Paulie? Huh?
There's a few wires here.
Oh, sweet. Okay. Anyway, I'm grateful to be here. I've never been to university. No, too poor. Too poor. But I like the idea of, somewhere on the way to this place is Bunjil. Is it?